Hello, and welcome to the AAMFT podcast, your all-access pass to the latest news, developments, and thought leaders in the world of systemic therapy. We strive to relate, educate, and innovate, one episode at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Karam, and we're brought to you by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Our podcast explores topics that relationship-based therapists care about. In addition to featuring unique conversations and interviews with established experts, our show provides information and education on direct practice and emerging trends in the MFT profession. For more information, please visit us at aamft.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Eli, back with you on the AAMFT podcast. Another great installment coming to you this hour. We have couple therapy pioneer Michele Weiner-Davis. You've probably heard that name. You've certainly heard of her groundbreaking divorce-busting concept, but you maybe haven't heard about the person behind the model, and that's what I love on the Pioneer series. We get to do a deep dive. More than the technique, more than the specific interventions from the model, we get to learn about the person of therapist. And Michele is going to share things today, especially about her own struggles that have made her a better therapist, a better spouse, a better parent that she's never shared in any other interview before. Michele Weiner-Davis is an internationally renowned relationship expert, best-selling author, professional speaker who specializes in helping people change their lives and improve important relationships. She's really among the first in our field to courageously speak out about the pitfalls of unnecessary divorce. She's been active in spearheading the now popular movement urging couples to make their marriages work and keep their families together. She is the author of 7 books. Of course, what put her on the map, as I mentioned, divorce busting. There is The Sex-Starved Marriage, a couple's guide to boosting their marriage and libido. She is the director of the Divorce Busting Center, has offices in Boulder, Colorado, and Woodstock, Illinois. In addition to her private practice, Michele is a highly acclaimed and sought-after speaker, known for her life-transforming, energetic, and entertaining keynote addresses. She has keynoted AAMFT, most recently, several years back, a tribute to Steve DeShazer and Insoo Berg when AAMFT was in Milwaukee. She ranks among the top presenters at national conferences, and you can find out everything else you need to know at divorcebusting.com. We will be back after the interview to tell you about a lot of exciting things coming up in the world of AAMFT. The first question I always ask Michele is your kind of origin story. What got you interested in couples or families or systemic therapy to start with?
Well, I'd say that there are 2 aspects to that, Eli. First of all, I'm fairly certain that being a therapist is in my DNA because I have a family filled with therapists. My mother was a therapist. I have an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, and those who aren't psychotherapists are all in the healthcare field, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and so forth. So I don't think I had a chance to be anything but, actually. But the truth is there's probably a deeper story about how I actually became interested in doing couples therapy, and I'm happy to share that with you.
I'd love to hear it. So you start wherever it started. Sounds like in your family of origin.
Yeah, by the way, when I do seminars for therapists, I often start by asking people whether they chose their career by throwing a dart, or is there a more personal reason, that they're doing what they're doing. And I would say for most people, there clearly is. And for me, that's certainly true. My family, I have immigrants for parents. And when very often when you have immigrants for parents, they came over with a lot of relatives, and your life as a child revolves around family time. I had relatives living within a few block radius, and we spent every holiday, every weekend, sometimes during the week having meals together.
And geographically, where are we now?
New York, we
New
are
York.
in New York, yeah.
Yeah.
And I have to say that some of my very fondest memories in my life were my childhood because of that family orientation. And my parents adored me. I feel very blessed about that. I have two brothers who I really adore. My parents never fought. So I will never be somebody who will be going to a therapist's office complaining about my early childhood. It's just not going to happen. Until one day, one fateful day, I was about 16 years old. My mom called us all in for an impromptu family gathering, which was not the norm in my family. And my two brothers, myself, and my father and my mom announced that for 23 years of marriage, she had been unhappy and she had gone to a therapist for 3 years, and after 3 years of working with the therapist helped her to make the decision that she really did need to get a divorce and go find herself. And I often say now I would like to go find that therapist.
Obviously, someone that was maybe not systemic or didn't expand the system to try to include your father at the time. So this hit you like a ton of bricks because you had this idyllic childhood. So you're one of these kids that didn't see it coming. So, and this is right as you were getting ready to launch, right, a year or so before you were ready to graduate high school.
Not even. I was a senior in high school, and so my little cozy nest completely unexpectedly fell apart with the words my mother used, Eli, and I can remember what they were. There comes a time in everyone's life where you just have to throw in the towel. And to say that I was devastated is really an understatement. And I tell people that at that moment, what I understood was that my parents' marriage would fall apart because that's what getting a divorce means. But I did not understand because I didn't have the wisdom or the developmental sophistication to yet really appreciate that the insidious ways in which my entire family would then fall apart. Because what was unbeknownst to me being a kid was that my mother was really the hub of the family wheel, and she organized to a great extent those family gatherings. And when she decided to get a divorce, she resigned from that position and no one else stepped up to the plate to take over. And in so many ways, that closeness, that connection, that sense of security, and that love just really shifted and dissipated.
I am curious because that is a powerful story, especially what we'll get to later in our talk as far as what you're known for, as far as couples therapy for one, taking one to tango. So obviously that influenced you not only professionally, but as a young woman. How did that change your relationship with your mother, who you had kind of idealized, and your father for that matter, as an emerging adult?
Well, that's an interesting question. So my mom and I, despite her decision to divorce, were kind of joined at the hip. My mother was an incredibly loving, nurturing person, and I have to say it didn't at all impact on my love for her, but I also must say that there were many, many times over the course of our long relationship where we had debates about what she might have been able to do differently. And to her credit, despite the ways in which her life changed after the divorce, she was always my biggest fan in my mission to help others avoid that same fate. So she was happy with her new life, yet incredibly appreciative of the choices that I was making in my career. So,
And let's talk about
yeah.
your career and then how you went from that into what you would become. So, everybody has a story of their early educational experiences or what turned them on to family therapy. So take us, because I don't know what kind of theoretical orientation or modality your mom practiced, but clearly you are synonymous with MFT, specifically couples therapy, specifically your own outgrowth of solution-focused therapy. So I want to hear about how you became kind of professionalized into the MFT world.
Okay. It was a gradual process because I think growing up in New York, and actually my father's even from Vienna, I inherited psychoanalytic genes. Um, and so the first time I think that I was exposed to a different way of thinking was when I went to Grinnell College, which is in Grinnell, Iowa, of all places, and they had a small psychology program that I was part of, but they were very behaviorally oriented. And it challenged a lot of my inherent beliefs at the time. I mean, for one thing, rather than look within the individual for pathology or the reasons that people are thinking or feeling the way that they were, this behavioral approach foisted me into thinking about what's going on currently in people's lives. What are the current reinforcers in the environment? And that was like a sort of a shocking way to think about things, as well as I always had this belief that unless you deal with underlying feelings and that you gain insight, that lasting change was not possible. And in fact, if you did that, clearly symptom substitution would happen so that the problems would pop up in people's lives in other areas. But I learned at Grinnell that there was not a shred of evidence to support this way of thinking. So that kind of started me thinking more in terms of what's going on in people's current situations. And I decided to go and get an MSW. And my first job after my MSW was as a school social worker. And what I felt so strongly at the time was that even though my primary responsibility was working with the kids and doing activities around values clarification, things that were going on in the classroom, in a way it wasn't making an impact because no matter what I was doing, no matter how great the work I was doing with the kid, they went home. And I didn't have much contact with the family because that really wasn't supported back then. I knew I had to work with families. And for the next 9 years or so, I worked at a small social service agency where I began doing family therapy. But being very much a person who likes to be helpful and be successful, it became pretty clear to me that whatever I had learned in graduate school wasn't particularly helpful. I learned a lot about theory. I learned nothing in terms of, I shouldn't say nothing, I learned very little in terms of pragmatic, hands-on, what do you actually do with people when you're sitting in the room? And so one of the things that I did back then is I hired a supervisor of my clinical work outside the agency. And thank God I did because she said, I have a book I want you to read. And that book was Uncommon Therapy by Jay Haley.
Yeah, wonderful book of stories. And you can read that book. I often think it's one of the first ones I read too, almost 2 decades ago when I started my career, in the sense that he was such a good writer that you could read and it would, you could read through the pages and you could see a session would come alive and what a story would be. But that was a game changer for many young therapists at the time.
And anyone listening to this, I highly recommend that you read this book. For me, Eli, what happened was I realized that there was just such a different way of thinking about problem solving. And it was a way that I didn't quite grasp. And that intrigued me. And at the same time, this supervisor that I hired suggested that I go to this place in Milwaukee called the Bree Family Therapy Center because she knew that they were practicing a therapy model that was very much based on Milton Erickson's work. And so I did.
What year are we in now, Michele?
So this is 1982.
Yes, right after the kind of golden age of strategic, and Steve DeShazer and Insoo Berg, who obviously have greatly influenced your career, set up shop in Milwaukee. So, which in the the solution focused model, obviously Steve spent time at MRI, so that was a kind of a natural follow up to what you had read in Uncommon Therapy and your experience with the supervisor. Where were you, in New York at the time? So you went from
No, I was living in the Midwest. I was living in Illinois, so Milwaukee was about an hour and a half drive for me. I drove up there, and they encouraged me that first day that I was visiting to sit behind the one-way mirror, and I watched a case where there was a couple, an elderly couple, and the complaint was that the man was experiencing bruxism. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's when someone grinds their teeth at night. And so what does anybody think when you hear about that diagnosis? At least I did. I was thinking, this is about stress. They're clearly going to be talking about, what are the stressors in this couple's lives and this man's life? But they did none of that. Instead, at the end of the session, Steve asked them to do an experiment. And the experiment was that they go home, and that night, and for the nights in between that session and the next, that they would switch the sides of the bed that they slept on. And I'm sitting back there thinking, what in the world is going on here? And sure enough, I went for the follow-up session. The couple came back reporting that this man had absolutely no problems with bruxism. And I did not understand it. I was intrigued by it. But I think the mere fact that I was clueless was enough to get me to sign up on the spot for their 9-month training program.
So that was literally your first experience on day one, and it hooked you. Wow.
Absolutely. And so for the next 9 months, I trained with Steve DeShazer. And I always tell people you wouldn't have wanted to know me back then, because I wasn't studying that then current model of solution-focused therapy. I became it. I lived and breathed it. I could think and talk about nothing else. I was so incredibly excited because it just shifted my thinking about so many things clinically and so many things in life.
A training program like that is so rich too. It's probably your first exposure to live supervision in that way, which accelerates the learning process. So that must have been like a whole new world for you, and just immersing yourself in that. And that at that time, before shifting to couples, you were doing a lot of family work, it sounds like, too.
I was doing family work, and I think what was so incredibly wonderful for me, and I talk to people sometimes when they get out of graduate school, is they don't have a clear framework of what you do when you close the door, what you say, and how you respond to people. And all of a sudden, I was learning about a structure that was much less interested in analyzing the cause of problems and much more interested in analyzing the cause of solutions. It wasn't just about, using my therapist mantra, asking people how they felt about something. It was truly about helping people create change. What I also loved about it, true to the Ericksonian philosophy, that it was so focused on people's resources. It was very goal and future oriented as opposed to being focused on the past. It just resonated with every cell in my body.
Yeah, from my experience watching you over the years and hearing you present, you're a very positive person. So I think there's lots of reasons young clinicians like solution-focused, and part of it is because it is built in health and strength and tapping into positivity. But that was certainly a welcome change for you. Other than Steve DeShazer, talk about some of your biggest influences at that part of your career as you started to learn about MFT and systemic therapy.
Well, I still have to linger there a little bit longer because after my training with Steve for 9 months, and I really do have to give a plug not only for Steve but for the idea of mentorship. I'm convinced that I would not be talking to you today were it not for the fact that Steve so generously decided to be my mentor. And I think that is just a wonderful role that people can play in our field. After the training with him, I became part of their staff, and I did research with a fellow named Wally Gingrich. So it was Steve, Wally, and myself. And we were really taking a look at when therapy is successful, what are the contributing factors to successful therapeutic outcome. And what we did was one person would work with a couple or a family, and the other people, the two others we coded the transcripts of the session, and each time a client reported change in the session, we would, in a sense, rewind and take a look at what it was that the therapist was doing or saying that elicited either a new way of thinking about things or statements about change. And it was an incredibly fascinating process, which I think led to a clearer definition of the solution-focused model that most people learn about today.
Yes, and it's interesting because talking to multiple model developers now on this podcast, the idea that their clients taught them the model, or the idea that reviewing their tape helped them refine their ideas and principles and techniques. So it was a very organic process, and what a amazing time. I think many people listen to this podcast, they will either be students or they are in their own practice where they have to see so many clients, and the time to talk and discuss a case and to break it down and to look at it is often a lost art. But what a clinically rich time for you. That must have been amazing.
Absolutely. And, there was another, there was something that really contributed in a very big way to my interest in working with couples, and in particular helping them avoid unnecessary divorce that stemmed from my stay in Milwaukee. There was one day when I was behind the one-way mirror, and I was watching a more experienced solution-focused therapist work with a couple, and they were having some struggles, some pretty kind of stereotypical kinds of struggles. And at first, the therapist was trying to help them uncover some solutions they perhaps had not yet thought about. But then when it seemed to hit a dead end, the therapist shifted the conversation to the inevitability of divorce. And I remember sitting behind the one-way mirror thinking, I wouldn't have asked that question. There were many other avenues I thought were more appropriate in terms of being able to provide additional solutions. But because I was a rookie therapist, I was a little intimidated to call in and make a suggestion. Instead, I had, in addition to working at the social service agency, I had my own small private practice. And I decided to go home and use my own couples in my private practice as my guinea pigs. And what I discovered over time was that the more I believed that there were solutions that were yet to be uncovered and continued asking what if kinds of questions, the more solutions showed up. And the more they showed up, the more I became a psychotic optimist that, this problem can be solved. And so one of the things that got me thinking about was, in Milwaukee, the therapist I was watching was more experienced than I, and I was using the same model. Why is it that I was getting a different outcome? And at the time, what I realized is that the person I was watching was happily married in either their second or third marriage. And I was in my first. And it started me thinking about the fact that when you go to a therapist, what you really get is much more than the clinical orientation of the therapist. What you get is the person behind the therapy model, the person who comes complete with values and assumptions and expectations that stem from the therapist's own personal life. And this is kind of a big deal because so often when people are needing help, like my mother who needed help, they often put more effort into figuring out what kind of new car to get than who's the person you're actually going to. What do they believe in? What is their stance? And so that's become a really important issue to me, that I think all therapists should be aware of, and certainly the general public.
I mean, we could have a whole hour just talking about that, in the sense that the self of the therapist, and, in some disciplines, you mentioned kind of psychoanalytic roots where the therapy should be value free and you should just be this blank slate. That's really impossible. So for you to know yourself and your values, and certainly the treatment that is delivered is important, but those of us like me have devoted their career to common factors and studying therapist variables. Who delivers the treatment is, we think, just as important, if not more important, than the actual treatment.
Absolutely.
So certainly, yes, someone sees you present or talk, your positivity, your confidence, it exudes through. So solution-focused people like it because there's these series of techniques, question-based. You don't have to be skilled or have lots of years under your belt to start asking miracle questions and exceptions questions. So talk about in your own kind of development how you marry the two, the model, the interventions from the model versus yourself of therapist. It's a great thing that we always talk about with young professionals, and I always ask people on the podcast the importance of who's delivering the treatment versus the actual treatment itself.
So I think, you started out before by asking me other influences, and I think, rather, and this is an answer to your question, you'll see it's a kind of a roundabout way to get there, but what a lot of the people who started influencing my thinking were solution-oriented people who were, in a sense, less rigid than the kind of structure I was just talking about. In other words, if you're a student of piano, for example, by this point I knew the notes and now I could play with feeling. So one of the first in the cast of characters to come along in my life who had an impact on me was Bill O'Hanlon. I know lots of people who are listening will be familiar with his work. He invited me to write a book with him, which we did, and it's called In Search of Solutions, A New Direction in Psychotherapy, which was actually taking some of what I think the key effective principles of solution-oriented thinking and making it, in a sense, less structured. And because it is a bit less structured, because what you're doing is agreeing to incorporate these elements, but doing it in a way that's more spontaneous, more like jazz. And, it's so important to me. I mean, I'm really wanting to talk a lot about bringing yourself to the process, but I think I'm going to jump ahead if I do. But I guess that's okay.
Let's just do it. It's fine. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, you were kind enough, Eli, to send me a list of potential questions, and one of your very last questions is about what's something that I might want to talk about that people wouldn't necessarily know through articles or books or so forth. Certainly, I've written 8 books and I've written lots of articles, and people may be familiar with my work through that. But what people don't know is that a number of years ago, I went through a bout of pretty severe depression. And as a result, there was a lot of stress in my life. And it was just like sort of one thing too many. And all of a sudden, although I had never been depressed in my life, everybody has an Achilles heel, so I've learned. And because it was so devastating and so scary, in addition to feeling incredibly depressed, I had the wonderful experience of having generalized anxiety as well, which I know often go hand in hand. But it lasted for quite a while. But the blessing in what happened to me is that because I was so eager to free myself from that mental state, I was on the other side of the coffee table in the therapy room and had the opportunity to experience what it's like to be a client, and learned so much from that experience. I need to just share this one story because it really now has completely influenced my work with not only with clients but anyone who crosses my path in life. I was so devastated and so scared about how I was feeling. A friend suggested that I go see a psychiatrist because perhaps I needed medication, and that was not my first choice, but I did do it. And the psychiatrist was wonderfully reassuring in my first session and said, I don't believe you need medication. I just think you need 6 to 12 sessions of CBT and you'll be fine. And I cannot tell you, Eli, what that did. The entire cloud lifted. It instilled hope. I knew I was going to be okay. In fact, I went home and had the first week of depression and anxiety. I had a depression anxiety-free week. I was ecstatic, and I went back. I couldn't wait to report to the psychiatrist what had happened, and when I did, here's what he said. He said, I'm glad you're feeling better, but I have to tell you that it's probably not going to last, and besides, you need to come to therapy to figure out why you got depressed in the first place, because not everybody's susceptible to that, you know. And what I can tell you is in that moment, the bottom dropped out. And I went back into a very, very dark place. And my search for solutions after that point brought me to the doorstep of you name it, and I was in that kind of therapy looking for solutions. And I can tell you that and by the way, multiple sorts of medications, antidepressant medications, which I can tell you for me did not work at all. And in fact, I would also tell you that most of the theoretical orientations, top down, bottom up, you name it, were not particularly helpful, but there were certain things that stood out that completely transformed the way I was feeling, and here's what they were. The therapy experiences that really made a difference had everything to do with two components. One is the relationship, the kindness, the personable connection that I felt.
Therapeutic alliance, yes.
Exactly. And you know, but that's such a theoretical term. I don't really know unless you're in this kind of state what it actually feels like. And I'll give you a quick example. I know a lot of people in the field will be familiar with Michael Yapko's work on depression. And fortunately for me, Michael Yapko was a good friend, is a good friend, and I called him to let him know some of the difficulties that I was having. And Michael talked to me for an hour. And at the end of that hour, he said to me, Michele, get out your calendar. I want to talk to you next week. I said, okay. And he did the same thing at the end of that next week's appointment. He did the same thing for an entire year. And somewhere in the middle of that, I said to him, Michael, I'm not going to have these appointments with you unless you let me pay you. Otherwise, we need to stop. And he said, Michele, you're not going to pay me, and we're not stopping. And that reaching out was, I think, probably one of the most powerful healing factors, because I felt a caring that goes beyond the therapeutic relationship. And similarly, I had another therapist here in the Boulder area where I live who actually, she wouldn't even call herself a therapist. She certainly had an MSW, but she was really more of a Buddhist therapist, and she tried so hard to get me to meditate. And I always say I was a yes but Buddhist because I just wouldn't bring myself to do it. But what she did do, this is a woman who every time I walked through the door, I could sense how happy she was to see me. She was someone who would check in on me in between sessions. She was someone who would send me a poem because it reminded her of me. I felt her, for lack of a better term, I felt her love. I really felt her love. And one of the things this has done for me, and I know I've heard you say, Eli, that you could tell that I'm, warm and hopeful, um, and I was all those things prior to this happening, but I have taken it to another level. So when I work with people, they can feel my intense laser focus when I'm with them. They can feel my warmth. When I work with clients who have when, for example, they're dealing with infidelity, most of my clients are, and they're feeling such despair. They can't believe they'll ever feel okay again. One of the things that I have learned in my own process is wanting to know, wanting to hear, you're going to be okay. This is going to pass. And so I, without hesitation, share with people. I know you don't believe me now, but the way you're feeling will be a thing of the past. You're going to look back at this process someday and say, that was really tough, but I've learned so much and I'm feeling so much better. Furthermore, I do check in on people in between sessions. I am happy to send them emails, again, intersession. I really want people to know that I care about them more than they're just being my 2 p.m. appointment. So it's the whole idea of building positive expectation, and also I'm completely comfortable, and I share this idea with people with therapists when I do training these days, the importance of bringing yourself to the process and being able to self-disclose in ways that are helpful to your clients.
Okay, well, that is an amazing story. Now, I've listened to you talk a lot, but I had no idea that you had undergone your own therapy, much less with someone who's certainly well known in the field, Michael Yapko. But I always like to tell therapists in training, I don't know why we don't normalize this more. One could say we should even require it as training programs to get experience on the other side of the couch, so to speak. I mean, what an amazing experience. I know early in my career to get that experience, and when I've had issues from here to here, from time to time in my own almost 20-year career, I've gone to see both individual and a couples therapist. So I think it's a wonderful thing. Why do you think we don't normalize that more, Michele?
You mean for people getting their own therapy? Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I thought you were going to say, I think it should be mandatory that everybody gets depressed. But, I think people should know what it feels like to be on the other side of the room. I learned so much. And by the way, I learned so much about having gone through dark nights of the soul. I mean, some people do outward bound experiences and they feel that they can do anything in life. And I did an inward bound experience, and it totally changed my life. And furthermore, I feel as if I'm so much more able to be present with people's pain of any sort because of having been there. So yeah, on both counts. Back to your common factors. For me, it is so not about the therapy model, because if I listed for you the kinds of theoretical orientations I experienced during this journey, it's almost funny because of that. But it wasn't the theoretical orientation. It truly, truly was the person.
I mean, you're making my day, because it's so refreshing. Almost every model developer that I have talked to, that I have great respect for, will just inherently, because it's what they know, they will go to the techniques of their models. But as my late great mentor Doug Sprinkle used to say, the alliance is a necessary but not sufficient, and meaning if that's all you have, it's not enough. But it is. Without it, you can't do good work. So
absolutely,
I love hearing that. Also, all of those different modalities and experiences. So let's catch us up to really what impacted. Not only, and I don't know where your personal therapy was in the timeline of, obviously most people are going to know you've written 8 books, but really I think what put you nationally on the map with the general public was obviously divorce busting. And what I love about that is that it takes these solution focused principles, updates them, puts them in just very easy to comprehend stories. And you tell a lot of good stories, and built into that your own work is your own vulnerability and making mistakes as a therapist, making mistakes as a spouse. It's I think also what makes you very accessible and approachable. So I am curious as far as your own therapy leading to what you would do and have done in your career with divorce busting and your own special brand of helping people save their relationships.
Well, I want to just take out a moment to give a plug to AAMFT because this is sort of the beginning of all of that. After I had written In Search of Solutions with Bill O'Hanlon, and it was such a sort of a big hit in professional circles, I thought, who needs this information more than the general public, and who in particular but couples who are struggling with relationship issues? And so there was a conference, an AAMFT conference out in California. I think it was like 89 or 90. And I wrote up a proposal to do a workshop that would apply all the solution-focused principles to couple work. And I couldn't think of a title. And I remember sitting in my home office and I couldn't think of a title. And all of a sudden, and this was around the Ghostbusters time, right? I thought, Divorce Busters, I got it. And the moment, Eli, that I thought of that title, all I can tell you was that I had this really strong feeling that this was going to become something. And so I got accepted. I did a workshop in California. It was standing room only. I was written up in the LA Times. I was invited to a number of radio shows. And as a result of that, I was a few things. I got book offers from Simon & Schuster, and I was invited to be on television and radio and Oprah. I mean, it was like a whirlwind experience. And I wrote Divorce Busting, which got published in 1992, and I think it was because I was probably one of the first therapists saying, neutrality is impossible. And even if it were possible, it's not a good idea. We need to do something to help people avoid unnecessary divorce. And I always tell people that my position has never been one of proselytizing, saying divorce is bad or immoral. And certainly in some situations, it's absolutely necessary. But it became my experience over and over again that the vast number of times when people are considering divorce, they're experiencing problems that are solvable with looking at things in a different way and learning new skills. And, because that book was published and became a bestseller, and the way media works, I became known as the Divorce Buster and quickly shifted from doing family therapy into specializing in work with couples who were teetering on the brink of divorce, which has been my life's work ever since.
I mean, that's an amazing story. I never heard the origin of the name. You were literally just sitting there, and it was partly the catchy name, but then your ability, again, to connect with people and audiences when you got that opportunity. I think now coming kind of full circle, it is not lost on me that given your family of origin story, that your ability to reach out to people on the brink and even people individually. And I think of what really that I gravitate towards your work and young professionals that I train is this idea of what if I can't expand the system? I can't get that other partner there. So when I think of it takes one to tango or couples therapy for one, that is amazing systemic application if you can be a couple therapist with one person in the room. So I want you to talk about that, and I want you to go full circle, talk back about mom. Is that the therapy that you wish mom would have had all those years ago when you were 16 years old? I And maybe you don't connect it, maybe you do. I don't know.
Well, of course, I wanted to fix my mom. Of course, I mean, I'll just start there. My mom eventually, and by the way, I should tell you that my mom ended up having an amazing career. She was a Holocaust survivor without an education, and yet became so well known in her own field. She became Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's right-hand person, and had a practice mostly in Europe. And she did just amazing work. But despite her incredible life, she many times said to me, had help been available to her back when she was considering divorce or looking for solutions, she wished that had been the case. Keep in mind, this happened, in the early 70s, and there was a cultural revolution going on. And
yeah, divorce replacing death is the most common endpoint
absolutely.
in marriage. Sure.
And so, I sort of have to understand that she was part of that, but clearly I wish things had been different. And it's so great that things are different now. There are so many wonderful resources available to people if they're struggling and they want help to try to preserve their relationships and their families.
Well, that's an amazing. So she was so accomplished in her line. Obviously, you stayed very close to her, and it sounds like she was very proud of her daughter. What were those talks like when you finally, when you were on Oprah and you were a bestseller list? What were those talks like in that part of your relationship with your mom when you
with my mom?
Yeah. Was she still your mom, or did you talk about work?
No, my mom had always been my very biggest fan. I talk about feeling blessed. I mean, growing up with that feeling of unconditional love and someone whose eyes lit up when I walked in the room, the fact that I was able to accomplish what I have was a great joy to her. So yeah, that was always great. And this whole idea, back to what you were talking about in terms of it takes one to tango, I'm a pragmatist. And I've noticed that in almost all relationships, and certainly in the clinical relationship, there's almost always one person who's more motivated than the other to work on issues. And so I didn't want that to slow me down. And I hear when I travel and do training, therapists saying that they can't do couples therapy unless they have two people. I so want to get them in training and brainwash them, because every person is a window into the system. And, I have to give the folks at MRI a lot of credit for this, really taking a look at the way in which problems develop and how they're maintained. And it's by people's problem-solving efforts. The very thing people do to solve a problem often becomes a problem. And knowing this information, when you have a motivated person sitting in your room, finding out what their goals are, finding out what they say their spouses, the absent spouses, the reasons they're unhappy, the things they want changed in a relationship, and then helping the person sitting in your room identify what they're doing that's working and what they're doing that isn't working, and then being creative and coming up with a game plan to change that old, more of the same behavior that's actually making things worse. It's really simple. There are times I actually prefer just working with that one person. And that's just for, relationship or couples therapy in general. But one of the things that I've done, and I've even created an online training program for, is that even when things seem extremely dire, where a divorce has been filed for, they're legally separated, or there's a hot affair looming, or the one spouse says, what part of I'm out of this marriage aren't you understanding? It's still not too late. And I've used this whole idea about helping people shift their more of the same behavior and call it the last resort technique, where I train the person who desperately wants to save the marriage. Their primary more of the same behavior has been pursuit. And everyone knows, whether clinically or in your own life, that when you are being heavily pursued, the natural inclination is to withdraw. We all know that. If you're listening to this podcast and you don't know that, go back to square one, right? And so my job has been to help that person who wants to save the marriage to figure out the specifics of quitting the pursuit and what they need to do instead. And I cannot tell you that, I should tell you that in the course of my career, which has been very lengthy, I would say that this technique, the last resort technique, is the one that I've heard most about in terms of emails and calls to my office thanking me for what seemed like a near impossible situation turning around. So I really want people who are listening to know that there is much that you can do to make changes in people's lives, even if you just have one person in the system sitting in your room.
And you can be a family therapist with one person in the room as long as you think systemically. I think that's
exactly.
Said. And maybe this is how you will answer this next question. I always ask people, and you have had great longevity, but as listening to you this hour, you're still as vital as ever. You still do the work for the right reasons, and you still are as passionate about it as ever. What do you want, thinking of these professional legacy, what do you want to be remembered for the most, Michele?
Well, so I guess first of all, what I'd like to say, it's stuff that we've been talking about, is that I really, on my professional epitaph, I want people to think about the fact that when it wasn't popular, when it wasn't easy, that it was really important to me to take a strong stand for trying to work out the difficulties in marriage, keeping families together and preventing unnecessary divorce. I also think it's really important to me that my training has been thought of as, I know this is going to sound funny, but theory light. And not to say that theory hasn't influenced me, because certainly it has. But not to the, it's been very important to me that when people leave the training that I've offered, that they actually have concrete, hands-on ideas of what to do and say when they work with clients, and that it is coming from a personal place, both in my training and my writing, and that's really just been incredibly important to me. And I guess there's one other thing, and if I could have, and I guess I'm working on it, sort of a second career, it's not just that I want people in marriages to love each other more. I keep thinking about, and maybe you'll know, Leo Biscaglia?
I do not. Tell us about Leo.
So Leo Biscaglia was this Italian guy, loving guy, public speaker. And actually, he was a professor. He taught a course on love. And his talks are so incredibly inspiring. He makes you laugh, he makes you cry, but mostly what you leave is with the feeling of a day of disconnection is a day wasted in your life. And with my clients, I am no longer just focusing on helping them learn the skills they need to to strengthen their marriages, but I'm really helping them to take a look at their relationships, with their parents and their siblings and their neighbors. I am so bothered by, if you Google the word toxic in terms of the books that are written about toxic relationships and this focus on dysfunction and pathology, my ambition in terms of the rest of my life is to help people shift their focus into other kinds of stories about people in their lives that they once have loved, and to really take another look at what it means to have emotional cutoffs in your life, not just with your spouse, but all sorts of emotional cutoffs. Personally, I don't think it's healthy for people. And so, in my career moving forward, I'll give you one short story. I was working with a couple. They were there about their relationship, but it came up in our conversation, this sort of challenging relationship that the woman, let's call her Susie, had with her mother, she was German, her mother was in Germany. And she goes, I don't understand. Susie said, I don't understand why my mother is always fishing for compliments, always asking me, how I think she did on something. And it's so annoying, it pushes me away. And so I said to her, do you ever compliment your mother? She goes, no, not really, because I feel pressured. I said, do you ever tell your mother that you love her and that she's done a good job in something? She goes, no, not really. And I looked at her and I said, what time is it in Germany right now? Because we were in Colorado.
Call your mother.
Yeah, I said, you're going to pick up the phone. I want you to call your mother. Now, you might ask, what does this have to do with couples therapy? It really is about feeling more at peace with yourself, feeling more love, feeling more connection. And it doesn't matter where that lands, but it's important that people focus on, rebuilding broken relationships. So
yeah, I think that's so true. Anything that could work in your intimate couple relationship should be able to work with other people you care about. And a lot of these principles that you've written about, like acting as if, and really the old adage, treat others the way you want to be treated, and it is really true. So I'm glad to see you. I always think of you as a couple and family therapist, as you've highlighted this hour. Those are your roots. So it's nice to see you, kind of broaden the frame just from the couple. But I got to ask one thing about the couple. One of the things that makes you, I think, so engaging, it's your vulnerabilities you showed today and shared very personal stuff about your own therapy. It's also, your stories are just real, and you talk about your husband a lot. So I'm really curious what he thinks about being the source of some of your best material.
I wish you were here now. Nowadays my husband comes to all of my training because he's my self-taught videographer, and we're doing a lot of online stuff, so he's always there. And sometimes when I tell, and by the way, you should just know that my husband and I have been together since 1973, married since 1977.
That's a great run.
It certainly is, and I'm really proud of it, because I can honestly say it's been very difficult. All marriages have their ups and downs, as do ours. We're different in so many ways. As I said, I'm first generation American. His family came over on the Mayflower. And think about all the values and philosophies that might stem from those different origins, and we deal with them. And so I'm really proud to say that, I walk the talk, that I really do apply solution-focused thinking to challenging times, probably not as much as I should. There are times when I tell stories in workshops when my husband will roll his eyes around, but in the end, I'm proud that I've been able to sustain a relationship over the long haul, given the challenges.
Well, Michele Weiner-Davis, what a wonderful story, and you are authentic and the real deal. And again, I think that you have taught us a lot today about just what good therapy is, not just good solution-focused therapy, and that it's never kind of too late to kind of, when you're stuck, to help other people get unstuck, to work on yourself. I think that I have all these ideas. We'll get to suggestions for podcasts, and one that I've been playing around with is having a model developer, a master clinician, and their non-clinician spouse come on and talk about what that's like. So you and your husband would be ideal candidates for that. Maybe we can do that later. But I am curious, what do you want? Obviously, another thing that's made get your message out there. You make your materials very available, including kind of online and old school. Go to Amazon, get a book. So please, in the end here, plug anything you want. What's coming up, if people want to know.
Well, maybe a few things. One of the most recent programs that I've created is for therapists, and it's about how to help couples heal from infidelity. I have done some keynote addresses where there have been thousands of therapists sitting in the audience, and I ask people, how many people here when they were in graduate school, learned anything about helping couples heal from infidelity. And honestly, in one group of 2,000 people, 5 hands went up. And yet, as we all know, infidelity is ubiquitous. And so if you're going to work with couples, it really isn't simply a matter of helping them develop better communication skills. Infidelity is, I think, a unique challenge, and that you do have to have skills that are specific to helping people through that process. And I've created an online program for therapists to really walk couples through rebuilding and healing and moving on with their lives. And, you know, if people want to write to me, Michele at divorcebusting.com, I'm happy to send them a link to the program, as well as my book for the general public. But a lot of therapists are writing me and telling me that they're keeping it in stock in their office by the same name, Healing from Infidelity. I've been pleased regarding the response to that. And then every year I've been doing what now is a 4-day training for people to come to Boulder, Colorado, which is a wonderful place just to be, to learn what I've learned over the years about how to deal. You know, it's so interesting, couples therapy, when you have two people who want to work on the relationship, for me at this point is child's play. But what do you do when one person wants in and the other person either isn't so sure or definitely wants out? So to learn how to handle those situations, as well as, you know, the topic of my TEDx talk, The Sex-Starved Marriage, how do you deal with couples who have a desire discrepancy, also healing from infidelity, how do you work with one partner, you know, in terms of doing It Takes One to Tango. So those are all topics that I cover in 4 days here in Boulder. So that's what I'm excited about these days.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, and I've really enjoyed this, and I know our listeners on the AAMFT podcast will as well.
Thank you, Eli. This is, you know, and I, in thinking about the questions that you were going to ask, it gave me an opportunity to reflect on my career, and also to reflect on the role that AAMFT has played from the get-go. First place that I presented, all the way going full circle to receiving an award for lifetime achievement. And without this organization, again, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation.
Eli, back with you. That was another great interview in our Pioneer series on the AAMFT podcast. Wow, I learned so much. Michele is extremely authentic. You know, when you're listening to this podcast, whether you're a young professional, a student, a preclinical fellow, you've been in the field a long time, not only is there a lot of history that you can't really get in your textbooks when you're listening to model developers, like Michele's journey through the Brief Family Therapy Center in 1982, her work with Steve DeShazer, and how that impacted her updated vision of solution-focused therapy, applying it to couples, developing divorce busting. If you listen to the interview, you understand how she got the name of divorce busting based on Ghostbusters over 30 years ago now. But you really can see the personal struggles that model developers have to deal with. It doesn't always come easy. And I was so pleased she shared with her battle of depression and what came out of that. Not only her work with Michael Yapko, but really her appreciation and understanding of what makes a difference, the difference that makes a difference in systemic therapy and also psychotherapy, if you ask me, which are these common factors. The person of the therapist, she said, is the most important, and the alliance, specifically the bond component that she had with Yapko. I mean, I feel like that techniques, models, they are certainly important, but what really makes therapy come alive are those factors she mentioned. I can't thank Michele again enough for her candor. Please go to divorcebusting.com Check that out. She is up to date with her technology, so distance is not a barrier. You can get a lot of her best materials and training, whether you are a clinician or you are the general public. Someone's trying to save their marriage, the last resort technique. You can get that all at divorcebusting.com. Thank you, Michele Weiner-Davis. Okay, on the podcast, a very exciting news. We are, as this podcast drops, less than a week away from AAMFT 19 in the great state of Texas, the great town of Austin. I will be there presenting with my colleague Adrian Blow on Sunday morning, September 1st, to close out the conference on these very same common factors that Michele was speaking about. But before that, we're going to be recording lots of great podcasts. We're going to do our first ever live cast. And we'll have a treat for you. So if you're not able to travel to Austin, you can log in to AMFT on Facebook at 3 o'clock Central Time, 4 o'clock Eastern Time on Saturday, August 31st, and catch the live cast of the AAMFT podcast. As always, we appreciate your feedback. A lot of great feedback on our various platforms. If you're an AMFT member, you can go to the AMFT main page, pull the tab down under podcast, and see archived our first 7 months of podcasts. Great installments, both topical content areas and these pioneering interviews. But you can also find us where you find your favorite podcast. I like Apple Podcasts. We've been getting a lot of great feedback there. It just takes a second. If you could please leave us a star rating and give us some feedback. It's very important in establishing this podcast among the leaders in other mental health podcasts. I really enjoy bringing it to you every time. Easiest way to get a hold of me is on Twitter. You can find me at Dr. Eli Live. You can also follow the AMFT, the handle at the AMFT. You can also drop me a line at info@elikaram.com. That's KARAM.com. Until next time, my friends, stay systemic.